This is Chris McKaylee, and this video podcast is comparing Congress and the legislature in the lawmaking process. And this comes from materials that were put together by Professor Tom Nussbaum and me at the McGeorge School of Law when we both taught the Introduction to Capital Lawyering course there. So for those in the legislative process at the federal or state levels, obviously, we have the California Legislature and the US Congress. And so I wanted to examine the strengths and the weaknesses and the powers and duties, obviously, of these branches of the federal and state governments. Both the US Congress as well as the California Legislature draw their authority naturally from the US and California constitutions, and they're provided with extensive powers and duties in the constitutions as well as in federal and state statutes. While they obviously deal with different levels of government, Congress and the California Legislature share similar roles in the lawmaking process. Each legislative body proposes and adopts legislation and budgets, and those are often then implemented by the executive branch of government and interpreted by the judicial branch of government. You know, the legislative branches of our state and federal governments are similar in many regards, but they also are different in several key aspects. Obviously, the California legislature and its bicameral legislature is based upon Congress, and they are both featured prominently in our federal and state constitutions. Both of these bodies have obviously the power to make laws, but they also have investigatory powers, budgetary authority. They confirm a number of executive branch appointments by the president and governor, but they also have some profound differences in how they conduct their legislative processes. So several elected officials who have worked in both the federal and state legislative bodies have noticed things like, with rare exception, while you can introduce any bill that you desire in both Congress and the legislature in California, that the state legislature generally hears and debates and ultimately votes on nearly all the bills that are introduced. So in Congress, thousands of bills are introduced every year, but a significant number don't even get a hearing, let alone a vote. Of course, congressional leaders limit debate and amendments that actually do get heard on the floor. Just by way of background, and in comparison to the California legislature, in the California legislature, between 2,100 and 2,500 bills are introduced annually. Upwards of 1,000 bills get to the governor's desk, and generally between 85 and 90% of those get signed into law. So about 40% of the bills that are introduced in the California legislature make it through the process and are enacted into law, while at the congressional level, that percentage drops more to the 3 to 5% range of congressional bills that are introduced that actually make it and become a federal statute. So let's look at the two constitutions. The Constitution of the United States in Article 1, Sections 1 through 10 spells out the authority of Congress to make laws. And generally speaking, the United States Supreme Court has broadly interpreted this authority for the legislative branch. However, the court has also reduced this authority when it finds it to be in conflict with the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution. The 10th Amendment says, "The powers not delegated to the United States nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." Thus, the scope of policy making, while it's very broad at the California level on the basis of the 10th Amendment, it's limited. So the US Constitution grants specific powers and duties to the Congress. The California state constitution instead basically grants the legislature what we call plenary authority, but limits it in certain instances. So the federal constitution is viewed more as a grant to the legislative branch, the Congress, of specific powers, whereas the California constitution is generally characterized as limiting, in a few instances, the power or authority of the California legislature. So the states can adopt most anything that they desire as long as it doesn't conflict with federal law. And obviously, such statutes can't violate any provisions of the federal or California constitutions. Now, the California Constitution in Article 4, as well as the state government code in sections 9,000 to 10,606, establish some of the procedures by which legislation is proposed and considered and voted upon at the state level. In general, our state constitutional provisions and these state statutes in the government code direct the legislature to adopt specific rules for the development and consideration of legislation. And so in turn, the Senate and Assembly have adopted the Senate rules, the Assembly rules, and the joint rules governing the operations of the two houses. You know, in both Congress and the legislature, the political parties and the party leaders dictate a lot of the legislative process and often the ultimate outcome of legislation. And this is due to the fact that the majority party enjoys a majority of the membership on committees and on the floors, and therefore they can generally control the fate of most legislation, at least those pieces of legislation that require a simple majority vote for passage. Both the US Senate and the US House of Representatives have an elaborate system of committees, in particular subcommittees, in which they consider federal legislation and the federal budget. Last I looked, US Senate had at least 16 standing committees and close to 100 subcommittees, while the US House had about 22 standing committees and nearly 150 subcommittees. So again, it's in these committees, but particularly in the subcommittees, where a lot of the legislation is heard and amended and acted upon. Given the size of Congress, obviously with 100 senators and 435 House representatives, there's a heavy reliance on seniority and expertise of members in determining committee membership. And the selection of committee and subcommittee chairs is generally determined by the party leaders. The California legislature relies far less so on seniority, but they definitely take into account expertise and political needs of their members when determining the composition of the Senate and Assembly standing committees. Neither the California Senate nor the Assembly has formal rules regarding how seniority and years of experience dictate the selection of chairs or committee memberships or other things. I think party politics naturally plays a primary role in affecting these types of decisions. And traditionally, the leadership of each house recognizes that experience and expertise and the desired or stated preferences of their members in making committee assignments and choosing leadership and all. Like in the California legislature, a majority vote is required for most actions in the US House and the US Senate, as well as their committees and in subcommittees. While one party generally controls Congress, as well as the California legislature, that can change from time to time, more often in the Congress than in the California legislature. In the Congress, House and Senate rules dictate debate and determine how you bring matters to a vote, which sometimes requires a 2/3 or 3/4 supermajority. The most prominent example, I think, is the 60 vote threshold to cut off debate. Otherwise, the rules allow virtually unlimited debate in the US Senate. And these types of rules, like the use of the filibuster, and to close it off, allow a minority of US senators to not only forestall action on federal legislation, but in some instances to bring the operations of the Senate, the US Senate, to a virtual standstill. A debate in the Senate can only be terminated by a cloture motion, which again requires 60 votes to pass. Thus, while a majority party may have votes to pass a piece of legislation, the minority party can, perhaps at least on the US Senate side, procedurally prevent that legislation from ever coming to a vote on the Senate floor. The US House and the California Legislature and their two houses don't have any such filibuster rule. Now, at both federal and state levels of government, through the annual federal and state budgets, both Congress and the California Legislature are able to provide or reduce or eliminate funding, and also to help direct executive branch activities through budget control type language. California can direct, I'm sorry, the US Congress can direct one of its many control agencies like the GAO, the General Accounting Office, the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, or legislative committees in this way to investigate like an executive branch agency or their actions or their efforts to regulate or implement state laws. The legislature can do the same through its committees, but also the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office, or the state auditor. Executive branch agencies can sometimes be pressured via whether it's informal, behind the scenes type efforts by the legislative committees, by party leaders, sometimes even individual legislators. And similar to Congress, both the California State Senate and the California State Assembly also utilize a committee system. There are 22 Senate committees and 33 Assembly committees, all generally referred to as standing committees, and then a number of subcommittees, particularly with the two budget committees. Their rules also specify the numbers of members on committees and other procedural aspects. Most bills in the California Legislature go through at least two committees in each house, generally a policy committee, and about 80-85% of all the bills introduced are keyed fiscal and therefore travel through the Senate or Assembly appropriations committees. Again, some bills might have multiple policy committee hearings, which we call a dual referral or a triple referral. So based upon the subject matter of the bill, they could have 2 or even 3 policy committee hearings before going on to the fiscal committee, always the last stop before the floor. In the state legislature committees, the authors present their bills and the committees hear public testimony. They might discuss the legislation, ask questions, and then they vote. Authors of the bills retain significant authority to negotiate and compromise on the ultimate language of their individually authored bills. And these legislators can often propose amendments called authors' amendments. They can also accept or reject amendments that are proposed by the committee. They even have authority to drop their legislative proposals entirely. And like at the federal level, the formative review of legislation occurs in these committees. In the Congress, the practice often is for the committees to take over authorship of legislation. Another important distinction I find between the federal and state legislative committees are how the bills are processed. In the committees of the California Legislature, the general practice is to work out the language and any changes prior to the actual public hearing, so that hearings are generally reduced to a brief discussion, a brief hearing of supporters and opponents and the author about the merits or the demerits of the proposed legislation, some nominal discussion, if at all, and then going right to a vote to either pass or defeat the bill. There are often time limits imposed on committee hearings, and of course, they just have the sheer volume of bills that have to be considered and acted upon by these committees in the California Legislature have a tremendous impact on that. On the other hand, in congressional committees, their hearings their markup sessions where the committee members really debate and amend legislation in their committees rather than just having a broad policy debate as to the merits of a particular measure. The congressional committees often engage in lengthy committee hearings where they debate and consider specific language and look at changing actual words of the federal bills. And so their process of amending the bills is done in an open public hearing process. Turning to budgets, in addition, the annual state budget is treated differently in the committee process in the legislature. So each house of the California Legislature, both the Senate and the Assembly, refer the budget bill and its trailer bills to the respective and fairly large Assembly Committee on Budget and Senate Committee on Budget and Fiscal Review. And there are 5 subcommittees in the Senate and 6 subcommittees in the Assembly Budget Committee where they accept or reject or amend the governor's budget proposals. And these subcommittee decisions are generally easily ratified by the full budget committees. And then, although it hasn't occurred in the past few years, historically, there's been a 2-house conference committee that's convened to resolve remaining differences between the Assembly and Senate passed budgets before final action is ultimately taken. So, in looking at the productivity of the 2 bodies, again, at the federal level, rarely do more than about 5% of the bills introduced in a section actually become law. At the state level, we get upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 new laws every single year. So, as I think you've heard, the roles of the Congress and the legislature are very similar when it comes to the lawmaking process, with a few exceptions and differences. And of course, their interactions with the president and the governor are, as you would expect, to be similar as well, because the chief executives at both the federal and state levels can generally determine the ultimate fate of legislation with their power to sign or veto bills, and which rarely get overridden. And so obviously the president and governor in California are able to exert a great deal of influence in the legislative process.